This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. With me now is Greg Sherman, a civics teacher at Conway Middle School in Orlando. Greg, tell us a little bit about your experience teaching civics.
Well, I'm part of the pilot program of the civics program, and I've really enjoyed teaching civics this year, and the kids have been very engaged. There's a lot to cover, but we try to make it interactive with the kids, and I feel like I'm on the foundation of this program, and that's going to launch statewide, and it's been very exciting.
It's so great to have you on board. Today we're going to be talking about the legislature as it relates to the structure and function of the three branches of government established in the Constitution. Greg, you must have lots of questions, so let's start with your first one.
Let's start at the beginning. Where in the Constitution does it mention the legislative branch?
The legislative branch is the first of 7 articles of the U.S. Constitution. It's the longest of the 7 articles, and it has the most sections in it. So it's number 1 in all kinds of ways. That's where it's found. And, at the same time, one could sort of look at Article 4. Article 4 talks about the state governments, but it says that the state government shall have a, quote, Republican, which is small r, not political party Republican, but small r, meaning representative government. So we also know from looking at Article 4 that the state governments will also have a predominant legislative branch of government. Absolutely. So it's sort of hinted at there.
Good. And what are some of the powers that we see the legislative branch have?
The legislative branch has many, many powers. The one that sort of gets the most attention is the power to tax, because we know without money we can't pay for anything else. So we see that sort of in 2 ways. One is in Article 1, Section 7, and just for context, Greg, there are 10 sections of Article 1. So we're sort of getting late in the game, 7 out of 10. So in Article 1, Section 7, we see that all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. Well, really what that means is if you're going to raise taxes, you have to introduce that bill to raise taxes in the House of Representatives. And the reason is because the House of Representatives originally was the only federal house that was elected, the only federal office that was elected directly by the people. Under the original Constitution, the U.S. Senate was elected by the state legislatures, and that was changed in 1913 with the 17th Amendment. So the idea that where the people have the most power, which is in directly electing the members of the U.S. House of Representatives, that's where all bills for raising taxes emerge from. Then you get to Article 1, Section 8, and it says, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes. So it gives the entire Congress the power to collect those taxes and to impose those taxes, but in terms of introducing the tax bill, that lays solely with the House of Representatives. But at the same time, they can be introduced jointly in the House and the Senate, since ultimately the House and the Senate do have to agree before it's sent on to the President.
It seems like such a complicated process to get anything done in the legislative branch. How can we help our students understand this better, this process?
Well, really, it's meant to be really difficult to get things done. When we read the Declaration of Independence, one of the abuses of power of King George III was that he taxed without representation, okay? So the fact that the people have the most representation in the taxing process is important, but at the same time, there was so much concern about being abused that really you have to get a lot of people together. You have to get a lot of people agreeing to come to the decision to actually tax, or to declare war, which is one of the other powers, or to decide who we have relationships with in terms of other countries, to decide what trade policy is going to be, to decide who's going to have the right to naturalize, to become a citizen. So the biggest decisions have to be made with the most consideration and deliberation. And so it was made to be a hard process because you've got people representing every single state in the Union representing districts within those states, elected by different groups of people, right? Right now we have 27 we have 25 congressional districts, but by 2012 we'll have 27 congressional districts in Florida. And in the district that I live, I can't vote for anyone running except in that district. I can't say, well, I really like the candidates in South Florida, I'll vote for one of them. Can't do that. So you've got completely different constituencies, and somehow they have to come together to decide what public policy should be, and that's a way to prevent them from abusing their power. That's one mechanism in place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we talk about checks and balances,
Mm-hmm.
separation of powers.
Yeah.
Often people will say the legislative branch is the most powerful.
Yes.
But aren't they supposed to be equal?
To other branches? Absolutely not. That's a great thing to say. I'll put it on a bumper sticker, but equality is great. But let's face it, Greg, you can't enforce a law that doesn't exist, and you must enforce a law that does. You can't adjudicate a law that doesn't exist, and you must adjudicate one that does. So indeed, we think about them as separate branches, and then equality is nice because it was raised in the Declaration of Independence and other things. But the bottom line is that without the legislature acting, then the other two branches can't react. The best that they can do is the president can go to Congress and say, I'd really like it if you passed a law that said this, that, and the other. And in fact, we see that once a year, right? When the president presents a State of the Union, he's also really implying, well, this is what I want the budget to look like next year, which means I want some of these policies to get a lot of attention and some of these policies to get a little bit of money. And if my goal is for all third graders to be able to read, then you're going to have to put money into that, right? But at the same time, Congress still has the right to pass or not to pass the budget, and therefore there are going to be some programs and services that get supported and some that don't. However, after the Constitution was written in 1803, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of what we call judicial review, which is the power to undo any law. Any action by a president can be deemed unconstitutional, but that came later. So the original design was to give the legislature the most power, but at the same time, the Supreme Court has a great deal of power because it can undo any act of Congress that it wants.
Who checks the legislative branch? Is it the Supreme Court, the executive branch, both?
All, and then some. When we talk about a check, what we're saying is that entity cannot function without input from someone else that they don't have control over. Therefore, some might say that a check on Congress is that every member of the House of Representatives has 2-year terms and that the senators have 6-year terms. So you could argue, well, that's a check, because after all, if I'm not a member of Congress, I can't sign off on legislation and be a part of that process more directly. I can't vote on something in that way. At the same time, the president has the power of the veto, which means that the president can veto a law, even if all 535 members of Congress decided that there should be a national holiday on Greg Sherman's birthday. National holiday, okay? Every person named Greg Sherman gets an extra $1,000 check or something, right? They could pass that legislation. The Supreme Court, with 9 members, 5 of the 9 can say that is unconstitutional. That is unacceptable. The president can veto it. He can say, I don't like Greg Sherman, so I'm going to veto that legislation. So even if we have every member of Congress working together, the president can veto and the Supreme Court can undo. Now, at the same time, in order to prevent the president from being abusive with his power, the Congress can override the president's veto, but instead of taking 50% of each branch of government in order to pass a law, you have to have 2/3 of each House of Congress to override. So there are checks either by other institutions of government, or you could say that the people themselves have a check through the elections process.
Why is it important for students to learn about the legislative branch?
It's important because it's the greatest power of government. It's also important because whether you know what the laws are or not, whether you agree with the laws or not, you are obligated to abide by the laws. And that's an important principle that, your students are about 12 years old, 11, 12 years old. So in just a few years, I'm sure a lot of them are counting the days till they can get a learner's permit, right? So they're thinking about driving and, thinking about speed limits. And they might say, well, I'm driving, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, which at 15 you shouldn't be out driving at 2 o'clock in the morning anyway. But let's say, they finally get a license and they're out driving at 2 o'clock in the morning and they're sitting at that red light that just will not turn green. And they're saying, oh, I'm just going to make that left turn here. I want to go home. I'm under curfew, right? That's another legislature, right? You got your parents. Yeah, I've got a curfew. Like, no. If the light is red, the light is red. So even if they say, well, I don't agree with that law, you still have to abide by it. And so the legislative branch is important for students to know about because they need to know what their powers are. They need to know what reasons that they have for making certain policies, because they have to abide by them, whether they know them or not, or whether they agree with them or not. Greg, I'm wondering, thinking about this idea about these great powers, even though we're so concerned about abuse of power in the legislature, we also have to understand that another check is an internal check, that there's a lot that the Congress can only do if the other House of Congress agrees with it. And so really what's interesting is that the legislative branch is the only branch with what we might call an internal check. Internal to the institution of government is that the House and the Senate have to agree on the tax bills. The House and the Senate have to agree on a declaration of war. And a single vote can be, if it's less than 50% or less than that, 2/3 for overriding. When we're talking about the War Powers Resolution, you need 60% of each House of Congress to agree. One less than that, and it doesn't happen. And so it's also important to think about sort of not only what are the institutional checks or the grassroots level or citizen level checks, but we also have that internal check. And that's another sort of way of saying, hey, people, don't abuse your power. And as we were talking about when we started this conversation, that's also true at the state level, right? That we have in every state except Nebraska has this bicameral legislature. And what that means is with a 2-house legislature that you've got an internal check. Nebraska decided under its rights under Article 4 to have a unicameral, to have a 1-house legislature. So it doesn't have that particular element, but certainly they have to agree. And so they have that as well. We only have time for one quick question. I'm just wondering if there's something that's burning that you need to ask.
One thing that comes up in mind is the amount of bills that actually die before they even get to move along to become laws.
Yes.
How can we explain to kids that there's so many of these bills and they basically just fall by the wayside?
Well, the way we explain it is through the committee system. There's a committee system, which means that you take people who have an interest, and many of whom represent areas of the country that are particularly concerned with some area of legislation, such as agriculture. And so if you have agriculture committees made up of people who represent those Midwestern states, or Florida, we have a big agricultural sector in our economy, if they're sort of looking at policies that have been introduced and say, well, this just won't work, it's actually a way to promote efficiency. Now, there are some people who say that because the entire House eventually has to vote on everything, they're going to be taking the committee's recommendation anyway. So when they say something has died in committee, what it means is that the committee has decided it's not worth deliberating on, it's not going to go anywhere, at least in its current form, and then from there it doesn't move forward. That doesn't mean that something can't move forward in another way, but it can still be voted down at the House level as well. So that's a really great way to end this conversation today, because it really talks about sort of how this group of 435 in one House and 100 in the other, how do they get things done? They get things done through the committee system. So great way to end this conversation. We've been talking about the legislature as it relates to the structure and function of the 3 branches of government established in the U.S. Constitution. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine.